Japan just chaotically made history by electing their first female prime minister. Who has already been threatened to be beheaded by a Chinese diplomat, used to be a heavy metal drummer, and has extremely controversial and polarizing views on immigration, foreign policy, and ironically, women's rights, but not in the way you might think. Which is why a lot of younger women in Japan are actually not thrilled about this. Clearly, a lot to talk about on her, so here's the rundown, all you have to know, in case she comes up in conversation on your next trip to Japan, you know what you're talking about. This is Sanae Takaichi, who now leads Japan. She is an ultra-conservative politician from Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, who some news outlets have compared to a Japanese Donald Trump, partially due to her views on immigration. She advocates for traditional family roles, and many speculate will initiate mass deportations of immigrants who have overstayed their visa. Symbolically, she very much did shatter a glass ceiling in a male-dominated political landscape, and you can find many clips online of Japanese women weeping tears of joy because they lived long enough to see a female prime minister take office. She's also lived breaking stereotypes of being a more passive Japanese woman by playing heavy metal drums professionally live, covering bands like Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath, and even appearing on the band Baby Metal's podcast, where she talks about loving metal since she was in elementary school. And other stereotype breakers like riding a motorcycle to school and around the country, even when, quote, it was against the rules to do so. She's also an avid car enthusiast to the point where her beloved MK3 Toyota Supra Turbo that she owned since the 1990s is now in a museum in Nara, her hometown, and forging an extensive and ferocious professional and political career for herself. That last part, of course, being the least anecdotal but the most substantial and important, because she did hustle in politics, pushing past 2 failed elections, pushing past the shock of, even after her success, members of the public repeatedly telling her, quote, "You won't be able to get married if you work so hard," and, quote, "You wouldn't be a proper adult without giving birth." She didn't give up, which is why a lot of people find it quite surprising that many political policies she supports are far less progressive, like opposing married women to be able to keep their maiden names after they get married, and opposing imperial succession for women, meaning only a man can inherit Japan's throne, which is like a Game of Thrones, especially because there's a bit of a succession crisis now with a shrinking number of male heirs, but Takaichi is still like, no, a guy has to do this. All of this draws criticism that her politics will set back women's rights in Japan, despite the life she has led herself. And these stances are all very important because right now, Japan is far behind many other G7 countries when it comes to women in politics and women in management, with only 11% of management positions being held by women in Japan. And for the sake of comparison, the same statistic in America, 43% of management positions are held by women. So this is a huge societal issue, one that many women with professional aspirations and goals are hoping that the politicians in power will fight with legislation. But will Sanae Takaichi do that? Many argue that her idolization of Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female prime minister, and subsequently her embrace of traditional family roles for women point to the answer being no. Because, like you might have picked up from some of the public feedback that Takaichi got herself, many interpret traditional Japanese values for women to be along the lines of, if you work too much, you can't find a husband, or you should quit your job and have kids. Not exactly a mentality that will help raise that 11%. But I honestly think it's much too early to tell. She ran her campaign promising to make childcare and babysitters much more accessible and well paid, with tax breaks, etc., so that more working mothers could focus on their careers, and promised to appoint a cabinet with Nordic levels of women, which I admit I had to look up, and it's referring to how Nordic governments often have higher levels of women in cabinet, like 63% in Denmark and 61% female ministers in Finland. However, when it came down to it, Takaichi only appointed 2 other women to her 19-member cabinet last October, which was the same number as her predecessor appointed, Shigeru Ishiba, who, yes, was a dude. However, definitely worth mentioning that right now, the number of women in the lower house of parliament in Japan is at a record high of 15.7%. Yes, right now there are more women in government in Japan than ever before, and that Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister of Japan, who was Takaichi's role model and mentor, also was known for his conservative stance on women's social roles, but he still implemented several policies that aimed to raise the amount of women in management in Japan, like the 2016 Workplace Act laws and his Womenomics campaign, based around the ideas that Japan can boost its economy by getting more women into the workforce. Did it work? Little bit. Point is, long story short, even though Takaichi has certainly lived actively breaking gender roles that may limit women in Japan, there is doubt that she will help others do the same, as she has promised, because of the ideologies her and her party embrace. Anyway, why did a Chinese diplomat threaten to behead her? So now let's cover her strong foreign policy stance and circle back to when she has already been threatened to be beheaded by a Chinese diplomat in a now deleted social media post. So put very simply, it started last Friday when Takaichi said that if China used a military blockade against Taiwan, it would create a survival threatening situation for Japan, insinuating that Japan would be forced to use militaristic forces of its own. China wants to do this, basically blocking off Taiwan from the rest of the world physically, and even going so far to implement cyber isolation, destroying Taiwan's undersea communication cables. And Takaichi stated that this would threaten Japan's national security, which would make it legal within Japanese law to deploy their self-defense force, which is basically Japan's version of their military. So a very high-stakes statement, with a lot of responses from Chinese officials, most notably and most wild likely being from Chinese Consul General Sui Ji-un, saying, quote, "That filthy neck that barged in on its own, I've got no choice but to cut it off without a moment's hesitation. Are you prepared for that?" Wild. Which you could very much imagine further fanned the flames. The post has since been deleted, but it was basically saying, as you can imagine, don't stick your neck into our business or else. And yeah, it was very widely seen as threatening towards Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who has been in office for less than a month. And Chinese Foreign Ministry demanded that she retract her remarks, and she did step back a little bit, saying that her comment did not constitute a change in government policy, but doubled down, clarifying, quote, "If it involves the use of warships and the use of force, I believe that this could constitute an existential threat, no matter how you look at it. And this will very likely result in far fewer Chinese tourists going to Japan from now on, because other Chinese government entities like their foreign ministry also responded to this by warning Chinese citizens to refrain from visiting Japan for the time being, citing safety and security as being the sole reason. Many Chinese airlines continue to share the sentiment by offering full refunds to anyone who wishes to cancel their trips to Japan. This has already affected trade between the two countries, and many obviously fear that this will escalate. A very volatile topic. And finally, how might the first woman Prime Minister of Japan affect me and you, under the random assumption that you are like me, a foreigner who may enjoy living and working in Japan? To sum it up, it may be more strict and more expensive. There is a fair amount of misinformation that I sorted through, like the post that received 9.5 million views stating that Sanae Takaichi was sworn in and immediately created a ministry for mass deportations. That was proven to be false, but foreigners that overstay their visa will no longer be given somewhat of an indefinite grace period to stay in the country, so those deportations will likely be happening. And apparently there are a massive amount of foreigners that go to the hospital and then just don't pay their medical bills. This was a very popular issue when she was running that she is cracking down on. For example, Tokyo Metropolitan Hospitals alone recorded unpaid bills totaling $1.13 million just in the fiscal year of 2024. Large protests in Tokyo stated that this was a big burden on Tokyo taxpayers, as well as a breach in the trust that Japan's healthcare services has built between their patients. Subsequently, people who accumulate unpaid hospital bills will either be deported if they don't pay, or what seems to be the more common occurrence, people going to the hospital and then leaving the country so that they can't be made to pay, they will be denied re-entry. That is part of her campaign that drew a lot of attention from voters, but even if you didn't skip out on your hospital bill, Japan will likely become more expensive if you move there from abroad, because Japan's also announced plans to dramatically raise foreign residency fees to levels similar to the US and UK. Visa renewals that currently cost 6,000 yen will soon cost 40,000 yen, so that's from $38 to $255, and permanent residency applications will jump from $63 to $639, and many other price hikes across the board, like a 3 times increase of the departure tax, making airfare more expensive, but that sums up a lot of it. These are all policies she promoted to increase her popularity with those who are suffering in Japan's current economy, even though tourism is flourishing. While her opposition states that it clearly punishes foreign resident workers who keep the economy running. And all of that might give you a pretty clear snapshot of why Sanae Takaichi is such a polarizing political figure in Japan. So please let me know your thoughts. Admittedly, this has been a tricky topic to cover. Depending on which country and which political party these sources come from, you get a very different interpretation of the facts. But it's important to know, and if, like myself, you have a vested interest in Japan work and student visas, this is an important topic to keep your eyes on. Thank you for watching, and as always, please consider subscribing and let me know what topics I should look into, cover, and make videos on next. Goodbye.